Between 1845 and 1852, roughly 1 million people starved to death in a country that was, at the exact same time, still exporting food to its wealthier neighbor. Another 2 million fled the country entirely, crammed onto overcrowded ships bound for America, so many of them dying on the crossing that these vessels became known as coffin ships. The cause wasn't war. It wasn't drought. It was a single, humble, unremarkable-looking crop a euro, and the collapse of an entire nation's dependence on just one variety of it. This is the history of the potato, and it's a much darker, much bigger story than most people ever learn. The potato story begins roughly 8,000 years ago, high in the Andes Mountains of what is now Peru and Bolivia, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, at elevation so extreme, cold, and thin-aired that few other food crops could survive there at all. Indigenous peoples of the Andes, and later the powerful Inca Empire that unified much of the region, didn't just domesticate the potato a euro, they domesticated an astonishing diversity of it, ultimately cultivating an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 distinct varieties, in every imaginable size, shape, and color, from deep purple and blue to bright yellow, red, and nearly black, each adapted to specific microclimates and altitudes. Andean farmers developed an intricate system of terraced mountainside fields at different elevations, deliberately growing different potato varieties at each level of the mountain, spreading their agricultural risk in case any single variety failed to thrive in a given year's weather. The potato was so deeply woven into Andean spiritual and daily life that it appears throughout Inca mythology, ceramics, and burial practices, treated as a gift tied directly to the mountain gods themselves. The Inca also developed an entire preservation technology built specifically around it. Chua plus or minus O, a freeze-dried potato product made by exposing potatoes to the brutally cold night air of the high Andes, then trampling out the remaining moisture underfoot the next day, repeating this freeze and press cycle for several days until the potato was reduced to a hard, lightweight product that could be stored for years without spoiling. This early food security innovation allowed Andean civilizations to survive famine years, supply large armies on extended military campaigns, and stockpile emergency reserves centuries before refrigeration existed anywhere in the world. For thousands of years, virtually no one outside South America had any idea this crop, or this level of agricultural sophistication surrounding it, existed at all. Spanish conquistadors encountered the potato during their conquest of the Inca Empire in the 1530s, and by the 1570s, potatoes had made their way back to Spain aboard returning ships a euro, treated initially as a botanical curiosity rather than a food source. Europe's reaction to the potato was, for over a century, deeply suspicious. The plant belongs to the nightshade family, the same family as deadly nightshade itself, and many Europeans genuinely believed potatoes were poisonous or associated with witchcraft and disease. Some religious authorities in parts of Europe argued that because the potato isn't mentioned in the Bible, it must be an unholy food. In France, potatoes were reportedly fed only to livestock and prisoners for much of the 1600s. It took a combination of famine, war, and clever marketing to change European minds. Repeated grain crop failures across Europe in the 1600s and 1700s made desperate populations willing to try anything that could grow reliably underground, safe from the trampling armies and foraging soldiers that regularly destroyed above-ground grain fields during Europe's constant wars. In France, an agronomist named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier famously popularized the potato in the late 1700s partly through a clever psychological trick a euro. He had the crop guarded by soldiers during the day to make it look valuable and desirable, then deliberately allowed the guards to leave at night, encouraging locals to steal and plant it themselves. By the 1700s, the potato had become a staple food across huge parts of Europe a euro, and nowhere more completely, more totally, than in Ireland. If stories like this are your thing, hit subscribe a euro. We drop a new hidden history of food every week. Ireland's adoption of the potato wasn't just enthusiastic. It became almost total dependence, and the reasons why are rooted in a brutal colonial land system. Under British rule, the vast majority of Irish farmland was owned by absentee English and Anglo-IR. Anglo-Irish landlords who rented tiny plots to Irish tenant farmers at high rates, while exporting the more profitable grain and livestock raised on that same land back to Britain. Irish tenant farmers were often left with only small, marginal plots of land to feed their own families. The potato turned out to be uniquely suited to this brutal arrangement. A single acre of potatoes could produce enough calories to feed a family of 6 for an entire year, several times more efficiently per acre than grain. By the early 1800s, roughly a third of Ireland's entire population, particularly the rural poor, had come to depend on the potato as their almost exclusive source of food, eating it at nearly every meal. And critically, they weren't growing thousands of diverse Andean varieties. Irish farmers overwhelmingly relied on a single variety, known as the lumper euro, chosen because it grew reliably even in poor soil, not because it was resilient. Ireland's food security rested on one genetically uniform crop, grown across the entire country, with almost no biological diversity to fall back on if anything ever went wrong. Something was about to go catastrophically wrong. In the autumn of 1845, a water mold called Phytophthora infestans arrived in Ireland, most likely carried across the Atlantic on ships from North America, where the same pathogen had already begun damaging crops. It causes a disease known as potato blight, and it devastated the country's potato crop with terrifying speed, turning healthy-looking fields into blackened, foul-smelling, rotting mush within days, sometimes overnight, spreading spores through damp air that could travel for miles. Because nearly the entire country grew genetically identical lumper potatoes, the disease spread with brutal uniformity. There was no resistant variety anywhere in Ireland to fall back on, no genetic diversity to slow it down the way it might have in the Andes, where thousands of varieties existed precisely as insurance against exactly this kind of catastrophe. The blight returned even more severely in 1846, and continued intermittently in following years. Roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Ireland's total potato crop was destroyed in the worst years of the crisis, wiping out the primary food source for a third of the country's population almost simultaneously. What followed became known as the Great Famine, or in the Irish language, and Gorda ma superscript 3r euro, the Great Hunger. And what makes it one of the darkest chapters in modern European history isn't simply the crop failure itself, but the political and economic response to it. Even as roughly 1 million people starved to death from disease and malnutrition, and workhouses overflowed with the desperate and dying, Ireland continued exporting large quantities of grain, butter, and livestock to Britain throughout the famine years, protected by British trade policy, with food convoys in some documented instances escorted past starving crowds by armed soldiers to prevent seizure. British government relief efforts were slow, deliberately limited, and shaped by prevailing laissez-faire economic ideology at the time, which discouraged direct government intervention in food markets on principle, even as the death toll climbed into the hundreds of thousands and then past 1 million. Facing starvation, disease, and eviction from landlords who cleared unproductive tenant farms during the crisis, well over 1 million Irish men, women, and children fled the country entirely between 1845 and the early 1850s, with sustained waves of continued emigration stretching for decades afterward. Many crossed the Atlantic on overcrowded, poorly supplied vessels that came to be known as coffin ships, so named because mortality rates on some crossings reached 20 to 30%, with disease, malnutrition, and brutal shipboard conditions killing thousands of passengers before they ever reached land. Ships were frequently overloaded well beyond safe capacity by operators eager to profit from desperate, fare-paying refugees, with little regard for food, sanitation, or medical care during the 6 to 8 week crossing. Those who survived arrived overwhelmingly in the United States, particularly in port cities like Boston and New York, fundamentally and permanently reshaping American demographics almost overnight. Irish immigrants faced intense discrimination on arrival, frequently encountering job postings and shop signs reading "No Irish Need Apply," and were often portrayed in American newspapers and cartoons through crude, dehumanizing caricatures. Despite this hostility, Irish immigrant communities eventually built some of the largest, most politically influential immigrant populations in American history, reshaping the demographics, politics, and culture of major American cities for generations. Ireland's own population, which stood at roughly 8 million people before the famine began, dropped by nearly a quarter within just a few years, and has still, to this day, never fully recovered to its pre-famine level. Today, the potato is the 4th largest food crop grown on Earth by production volume, behind only corn, wheat, and rice, and it remains a dietary staple across dozens of countries on nearly every continent. And the exact same vulnerability that devastated Ireland in the 1840s hasn't fully disappeared from modern agriculture. Modern industrial potato farming, particularly the vast supply chains behind products like fast food French fries, relies heavily on a small handful of specific commercial varieties, most famously the russet Burbank, grown across massive monoculture farms with far less genetic diversity than the thousands of varieties still carefully preserved by small farmers in the Andes today. Plant scientists and agricultural researchers continue to warn that a new, more aggressive strain of blight, or an entirely new disease adapted to modern varieties, could someday threaten industrial potato agriculture in a strikingly similar way to 1845, on a scale that could disrupt food supplies for hundreds of millions of people who now depend on just a few genetically narrow varieties. Next time you eat a plate of fries or a simple baked potato, you're eating a crop that was once widely considered poisonous, that fed and then starved an entire nation within the same century, and that permanently reshaped the population of a country an entire ocean away. One small, unremarkable vegetable sitting at the center of one of the largest human tragedies in modern European history. If this one got you, check out our video on the history of corn next. A completely different crop, but the same story of how deeply agriculture shapes human history. Subscribe if you want a new deep dive into the hidden history of food dropped every week.